There's a town about an hour north of Dallas that most Texans couldn't find on a map. No pro sports team, no skyline. Until a few weeks ago, most of the country had never heard of it. And yet right now, in that town, there is a single construction project worth more than the entire economy of several US states combined. I'm talking about Sherman, Texas. And what just opened there should be reshaping how you think about where American manufacturing actually lives. Here's the scale, so you're not misreading this. Texas Instruments, one of the largest chip makers in the country, just flipped the switch on its first 300mm wafer fab in Sherman. That's one factory. It's part of a plan for 4 factories on that same site. And that site is one piece of a broader $60 billion investment TI is pouring into Texas and Utah combined. For 7 fabs total, $60 billion, in a town of about 45,000 people. I'll show you exactly why they picked this spot, what almost nobody outside the industry noticed about the timing, and why the empty floor space inside that new factory might be the most important detail in the whole story. If you're the kind of person who tracks what's actually happening to Texas underneath the headlines, subscribe. And drop your city in the comments. I like seeing where everybody's watching from, especially if you're anywhere near North Texas. So let's start with why Sherman. This isn't a company parachuting into nowhere. TI has been in North Texas for close to a century, and Sherman specifically has hosted TI manufacturing for around 60 years, going back to a much older 6-inch wafer facility. That matters because when a company builds new, it usually goes where it already has workforce, land, permitting relationships, and political goodwill. Sherman had all three. And here's the detail that got buried under the ribbon-cutting photos. The company sunset that old 6-inch line at almost the exact same time. It broke ground on the new 300mm site, meaning this wasn't really a new factory in a new town. It was a generational handoff, decades of institutional knowledge getting physically rebuilt 3 miles away in a form that's roughly 10 times the wafer size. Now here's where it gets interesting, because this is a story about scale mismatch. From breaking ground to actual production, TI says it took about 3.5 years. Governor Greg Abbott showed up for the opening. So did the Sherman mayor, whose own grandfather had worked with Jack Kilby, the TI engineer who co-invented the integrated circuit back in 1958. That's not a coincidence they threw into a speech for color. That's the state trying to tell you something. Semiconductors have quietly become the thing Texas wants to be known for next, the way oil once was. But here's the catch. Walk inside that new fab right now, and it's running at nowhere close to full capacity. Executives on-site describe the building as maybe 30 to 50% utilized. There's a second connected shell, SM2, sitting right next to it, already built, completely empty, waiting for demand to justify tooling it up. So the real question isn't, why did they build something so big? It's, why would a company sink tens of billions of dollars into floor space it doesn't need yet? And the answer tells you TI is betting on a much bigger trend than one factory. TI's own leadership has said the goal is to manufacture more than 90% of its chips inside its own US facilities by the end of the decade, up from where it sits today. That's a company deliberately un-outsourcing itself. In an era where most of the semiconductor supply chain runs through Taiwan, South Korea, and a handful of overseas fabs, TI is doing the opposite, building excess capacity on purpose, inside US borders, years before it's needed, because the lead time to build a fab is measured in years, and the lead time to lose a global supply chain war is measured in weeks. Would you say Texas is now doing on purpose for chips what it once did by accident with oil, becoming the place the entire country quietly depends on? Let's talk about what's actually coming out of Sherman, because it's not what most people picture when they hear semiconductor factory. This isn't the flashy AI chip story you've been reading about with NVIDIA and TSMC. TI makes analog and embedded chips, the unglamorous foundational components that don't do headline-grabbing AI work. They do the boring, essential job of managing power and signals. TI's own framing is blunt. If it plugs into a wall or runs on a battery, there's a good chance a TI chip is inside it. Cars, refrigerators, medical devices, satellites, data centers. About 3/4 of TI's revenue comes from just 2 sectors, industrial and automotive, and Sherman's first products are aimed squarely at battery management systems, automotive lighting, and power delivery for data centers. And that data center detail is where this story connects to something you've probably already heard me talk about, the Texas power grid. Every AI data center going up around Texas needs power converted, regulated, and delivered efficiently. And that's exactly the kind of chip Sherman is built to produce. So this fab isn't separate from the AI boom, it's the plumbing underneath it. The unglamorous physical layer that has to exist before any of the flashy stuff works at all. Here's the workforce piece, because this is where the why nobody talks about it part really shows up. TI didn't just hire a few thousand new people out of nowhere. As the old 6-inch line wound down, workers were retrained and moved onto the new 300mm equipment, and TI pulled additional talent from across North Texas's existing manufacturing base to staff the ramp. That's a quiet, unglamorous migration of skilled labor happening inside a metro area most people only associate with Dallas's skyline, not with clean room fabrication, and the automation inside that building is its own story. TI says essentially all of the wafers move around the factory floor on an overhead transport system, riding in sealed carriers, with robotic reticle delivery in the lithography bays. Instead of storing wafers in floor-level parking garages the way older fabs do, Sherman stores them overhead on the ceiling between manufacturing steps, freeing up clean room floor space, which is the single most expensive square footage in the entire operation. That's not a minor engineering choice. That's the difference between a factory that can scale smoothly into that empty SM2 shell next door and one that hits a wall. If you live anywhere along the I-35 corridor or in that North Texas to Sherman stretch, do you think this kind of manufacturing growth ends up pulling more people north out of Dallas? Or does Sherman just stay a company town? So here's the reading, what this actually means. Sherman is a preview of a pattern that's about to repeat across the state. Texas isn't just attracting people anymore, it's attracting the physical infrastructure of entire industries. Chips, data centers, power generation, all landing in mid-sized towns that don't show up on anybody's radar until the ribbon cutting. TI alone has multiple more fabs planned across this decade in Sherman and in Utah, all tied to that same $60 billion number. Multiply that by every other semiconductor and data center project currently breaking ground across the state, and you start to see the real story. Texas is quietly becoming the physical backbone of American chip manufacturing, years before most of the country notices it's happening, and every one of those factories needs water, needs workers, and above all, needs power from a grid that's already stretched thin from the last wave of data centers. Sherman isn't the end of that story. It's the opening chapter. That's the part almost nobody connects. A small town outside Dallas quietly becoming ground zero for whether America can actually build its own chips at home. See you in the next one. If this is the kind of thing you want tracked as it happens, subscribe, and I'll keep bringing you what's actually building up underneath the headlines.